Hi, welcome to Talking Books and Stuff, the program that talks all about books and writing and stuff. Here's your host, Dennis Rimmer.
Hello and welcome back. This is Talking Books and Writing and Stuff. Today we're talking about books and writing and stuff, including the fur trade and all sorts of other stuff with Stephen Bown. Stephen Bown is a historical nonfiction author, writer, researcher. Good day, Stephen. First of all, how did you ever get into this line of work?
Well, I've been writing for, decades, I think. 20 years now. This is my 11th book, so I have to think back in time. How did I get into writing? I wrote some articles, and then my wife and I moved from Ottawa out to Canmore, and we were, Canmore in the Rocky Mountains here in Alberta, and we had been wondering what to do, and I started writing a bit more, and because it just, one thing went to the other, and I just started writing more and more books, and had a whole bunch of success with some of them, and so here I am, 20 years later, still working on it.
Still doing it. Well, that's good. That's the unconventional yet popular way to success. Stumble into something you like to do, and all of a sudden they give you some money for it. So why not?
Yeah, I mean, I don't normally write about Canadian topics, I have to admit. Usually I write about global things and explorers, like Roald Amundsen, the famous Norwegian explorer who went to the South Pole, and I wrote about scurvy in the Royal Navy and how it was a medical mystery that was solved and allowed Britain to, stave off Napoleon's defeat of that island in the 19th century. And I've always been interested in the fur trade in Canada. I'm one of those people that when I travel around and I see a historical marker, I'm the type of person that pulls over and reads it. I go to those living history sites and see what's in them, the fur trade posts or the forts, or something important or exciting or interesting happened in an area. I often will go there and imagine what happened on the side of the river, if there was a battle or something like that. So, it was a natural progression. I just, so many things having to do with the early history of this land revolve around the fur trade. It was just went on for several centuries, and that, tectonic changes to society that happened during that time, all the politics, the cultural changes that happened with indigenous peoples, the commerce that completely altered, historical patterns of trade and travel, really fascinating, interesting people, the creation of a whole separate people, the Métis, all arose out of the fur trade and its interactions. So, and so many interesting stories. I just love to look back and think about all the lives that these people lived and the context of the lives that they lived. Society was very, very different than what it is now, of course, but genetically the people are exactly the same, and they were making decisions for themselves and planning their world with completely inadequate geographical knowledge or communication. There was no roads. There was no way for people to communicate. They didn't understand each other. There's so many interesting things sort of all come piling together into that one pot of history. And that's what I tried to tackle on, 200 years of that history in my book on the Hudson's Bay Company. I really want to show change over time, I think. It was that was one of my main themes, that over 200 years, it's impossible to sum up, any particular interaction and have that apply. You can't say, the Hudson's Bay Company was this, the Hudson's Bay Company was that, or Hudson's Bay Company was good or it was evil or whatever. It went on for hundreds of years. So it was all of these things and a whole bunch of other stuff as well. Really fascinating story.
And the story is The Company by Stephen R. Bown, as in Brown without the R. The Company, The Rise and Fall of the Hudson's Bay Empire. Now, the fur trade, why were people looking for furs, Europeans looking for furs over here? Didn't they have enough clothes where they lived?
Well, I mean, there were furs in Europe. A lot of them came from Russia, and they ended up being, through politics. I mean, they could be expensive. And furs had some practical uses. They had some water shedding abilities that were used in military applications to prevent, gunpowder from getting wet. Or, of course, they were luxurious for wearing in the winter, and they could be made into felt, which had its own properties like water shedding, or, it could be molded into various different shapes. But one of the key drivers was a fashion that had to do with hats and headgear. I mean, because it could be made into felt, it could be shaped. And so all those different funny hats that you might see on old photos or movies, period pieces, the tricorn military hats, the big stovetop hats of the capitalists, and the ladies' hats all shaped and adorned into these elegant confections on their heads. I mean, all of that fashion suddenly was creating a demand for furs. And of course, beaver furs were the most valuable. And the Hudson Bay Company started off very small. It was originally just sort of to bring some of these furs, as a fashion accoutrement. Never needed to have a hat because there were no plastics or other exotic fibers that we use to make things now. So, anything that could be made out of felt or fur was a very valuable thing. And the demand was such that the trade kept increasing all the time. And the best furs in the world were coming out of, North America at that time, where there was vast numbers of beavers. And along the St. Lawrence Seaway, even down the Albany River in New York. I mean, that area had been sort of cracked out very early because of the early, the French colonial presence along the St. Lawrence, and the Americans using the Albany River. So when the British got a hold of this idea, which actually ironically came from two Frenchmen disenchanted with their own government, the certain aristocrats who invaded into that thought it would be a really good way to sort of make a bunch of money for themselves, as well as screw over their political adversaries in New France, right? So
when we're talking about money, as it were, back then, what kind of money are we talking about? How did everybody finance these trips to the unknown region of what we call Hudson's Bay?
Well, money is an unusual concept. I mean, a lot of the fur trade, of course, was based on a barter system, at least the aspect of it that took place over here. I mean, the economies in Europe were operating on a monetary exchange, where the coins or bills or whatever were like sort of metaphorical representations of value that people accepted and traded amongst each other for things that they wanted. When they came over to North America, it was more of a barter system. The company, those two Frenchmen that I had alluded to earlier, they had been involved in the fur trade. They had done extensive travels to the west of New France, all the way out to the western edge of Lake Superior. And these fellows, Radisson and Groseilliers, they observed something interesting when they were out there. They said there was already significant trading centers in the Mandan settlements, the rest of Lake Superior, where goods from all over the continent were coming into these zones. You could have flint, and you could have dried different foods and fishes and berries and ornaments and potteries and arts and crafts and furs and dried corn, or all these different commodities were already being traded at these areas. And the rivers were the main arteries of commerce. And they kind of had this idea that, wow, if we could somehow get here and tap into this pre-existing commercial network, we could probably make a fortune by supplying the one item which was not in abundance, and that was anything made of metal. Metal was not part of the commercial trade network of the interior of North America. And on the return expedition from this in the mid-17th century, they managed to take a detour, and they went up north as far as the southern coast of James Bay, which is just south of Hudson's Bay. Some Cree guides led them up there. And they were aware of some of the writings about English explorers like Henry Hudson and Fox and James, the two competing British guys searching for the Northwest Passage. And they knew that English ships had made it in that far to the continent. So therefore, if they could just get a little bit further on these river systems, they could tap into that pre-existing commercial network. And so they had this idea. They went back to New France with it, and the governor was a bit of an AH towards them and kind of stole a bunch of their furs, saying you didn't have a proper permit. The New France at the time was trying to manage. They had a supply management for furs, kind of like what they have for dairy now. They wanted permits, and they wanted to control who was going to be involved in this commerce. And these guys were rogues, and they went out and did their own thing. And so they felt entirely screwed over by their own government, and they tried to peddle this idea. They decided to go over to England and peddle this idea of the English king. And of course, as soon as through various means, they managed to get an audience with the king, and they presented this idea, and they were quite charismatic. And I guess you would call them promoters or schemers these days. Yeah, they went over there with the grand ideas, and yes, we'll do this, and they think of the money and think of the profits, and it's quite simple to go there and do this. And they sold the English on this idea that, hey, you've already been to Hudson's Bay. Send your ships in there. We'll get onto the river systems. We'll start supplying utilitarian metal items that will then become extremely valuable because they're not represented in the general mix of trade goods that's found there. And that was the whole genesis of the idea for the Hudson's Bay Company was, sail over there, bring something that wasn't already available, and bring back furs. And that's how it all started. And it began as a barter system, like metal goods for furs. And, the value of these things fluctuated over time according to supply and demand and, the seasons and the distance that people had to travel to get there and whatnot. Essentially, the Hudson's Bay Company built a string of, primitive little forts along the coast of the bay. And, essentially were operating like wholesale distribution centers from those forts. And a lot of the I'll call it the retail aspect of the trade, the trade that ventured inland. For the first 100 years, the company never went inland. It just sat there on the shore of the bay in these outposts. And the whole retail aspect of the trade was operated by various different, primarily business distribution and commercial. Let's call it business. They didn't keep paperwork, but they were multi-year business circuits that a lot of these people were going, collecting up, buying furs from the interior of the continent and doing their own trade and then bringing it up to the Hudson's Bay and using those posts as their wholesale distributors. And this went on for, 100 years like that, with everything funneled towards Hudson's Bay, and all the furs were going out there, and metal implements, especially knives and hatchets, axes, needles, guns. All this stuff sort of filtered west and south into, what's now central and western Canada.
And we're talking with Stephen R. Bown, as in Brown without the R. I just have to keep reminding myself of that. This is Talking Books and Writing and Stuff. The main book here is The Company, The Rise and Fall of the Hudson's Bay Empire. And it's interesting you mentioned Radisson and Groseilliers because we're sitting right now in Radisson, Saskatchewan, so probably named after, I'm sure, the Radisson. And even when I was a kid, oh gosh, was there a TV show, Radisson? I didn't know, we call it Groseilliers, but sort of like a Hawkeye and Chingachgook kind of TV show years ago in the 50s maybe, because I've heard the name all my life. So if it wasn't for Radisson, there wouldn't be a Radisson here today. Is that what you're telling me?
I'm pretty sure that it must have come from that. It must have been some tie into the old fur trade, because the French were there too. I was talking about the Hudson's Bay Company earlier, and it's English and indigenous allies that were working. But there were always French incursions that were coming, west. They had a very long supply line, though, and there weren't a huge number of them, especially when Quebec City fell to the British forces in 1759. The French were more or less eliminated from the trade at that time, and then it wasn't until much later, several decades later, that the Northwest Company began arriving with. Once New France became part of the British Empire, merchants in Montreal could have access to the capital markets in London, and they used that to set up their new enterprises and to sort of start venturing further and further west, and that ended up being in competition with the Hudson's Bay Company. Eventually, those two companies merged later too, but that was until 1821. But yeah, the Radisson could very well actually come from Pierre Esprit Radisson, the famous rogue, like some people would call him a swindler or a boaster or a guy who had this idea and he didn't really know if it was going to work or not, but he went and sold it to the English king and started the whole thing rolling.
And we're talking about the company, the rise and fall of the Hudson's Bay Empire. They called their earlier forts factories, so we even have some names still around these days, Moose Factory or something like that. So I always wondered what that meant, but that was a fort then, right?
Yeah, that would have been one of the. I think that the term factories has different meaning today. I mean, back then it meant that the factor was present, and the factor was the person in charge. Like sometimes they would, if two aristocrats were negotiating over something in a land deal, whatever, they would not want to do it themselves because it sully their hands with the dirt of commerce. They would sort of say, "My factor will be in touch with your factor," and so yeah, it's kind of funny. I mean. So that's what a factory was. It meant that the factor was present, someone who was the local manager for a larger concern. So yeah, all these places that were called factory, York Factory, Moose Factory, I mean, factories were, sometimes they called them forts too, but they weren't forts in the military sense, like Fort Edmonton, it wasn't Fort Garry, which became Winnipeg. I mean, there's tons of other forts all over Western Canada. I mean, they weren't military forts like that. They just happened to take on that word over time. Forts or factories, same thing.
And on the cover of the company, The Rise and Fall of the Hudson's Bay Empire, people in canoes paddling off into the distance. So I'm seeing that and I'm thinking, seems to me there was a pretty good relationship between the company and its workers and the indigenous Cree people. It's kind of a shame that relationship didn't carry on the way it started out to be.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the central themes of my book. I mean, it of course evolved over time, like 200 years of time. You're obviously going to move through different phases of interaction. But I mean, the very first thing that anyone associated with the company had to do when they arrived in Hudson's Bay was learn the local language and customs. And the first places that had to do with the Cree who lived in that area. And the Cree, are inextricably linked to the company and its expansion across Western Canada and into the U.S. And that's why, even in the mid-19th century, Cree was spoken on the Pacific Ocean. I mean, it never would have been without that. Just the company's relationship with the Cree was long-standing because when these people sailed across the ocean, for example, on a creaky ship from London, with all the sails busted and the crappy, weevily food and the scurvy poisoning them and everything, and they get off the ship on this barren, wind-lashed shore of a bay in the middle of nowhere, and they kind of look around like, holy crap, where am I? I mean, there's no way to easily get back. Well, ship came once a year, and it was a dangerous voyage that takes 6 weeks each direction. So a lot of the people, they signed on at least 7-year contracts. And many of them renewed their contracts and stayed there. Of course, they married, they learned the customs, they learned the traditions, they had their own children, their families were there. Right from the very beginning, it was not just a commercial enterprise, but it was a form of cultural diplomacy and diplomatic marriages between people. So right from the very beginning, the company's workers, employees were always, I like to say it was at least half Indigenous. I mean, they didn't sign employment contracts in London because they weren't in London, but all those people who did hunting and they did guiding and they were making the canoes and the boats and doing all the labor in the forts and doing the trade, and then their children who were, the mixed heritage children were taking on all the roles of the company. And this went on for, 150 years, where the company was very much intertwined with all the indigenous companies, all cultures. I mean, and their officers and the people who worked for the company who came from Britain, almost all of them had indigenous wives and indigenous children, and that's where that all arose from. And I'm not saying that everything was perfect all time between peoples. Of course, there were conflicts and there were negotiations and the politics, and but the company existed at the sufferance of other people. And they were inextricably linked with multiple indigenous societies throughout that time. And huge aspects of the inland part of the trade, the retail part of the trade, were actually run exclusively by indigenous business operatives, like like a fellow, one of the famous ones that emerges from some of the writings is Atticushish. I mean, there's Anthony Henday. Anyone knows the name of Henday. There's university buildings named after him in Edmonton, and there's, little historic markers in Saskatchewan. Anthony Henday went here and did this. But consider, Anthony Henday didn't know it. And he spoke some Cree because he was there on the coast. And he wanted to explore inland, and the company said, okay, finally, we'll let you go inland. We've never sent anyone inland, but we've been here 100 years, so maybe we'll let you go. And how did he do this? He went down, and there was a fellow named Atticushish who used to show up every year with multiple canoes worth of people's goods, because he was running these trade networks. He would spend years traveling around, doing all this trade, bringing all the goods all together, all the furs all together to the coast, at York Factory, and negotiating better deals by doing it himself, right? And so he agreed to take Anthony Henday with him into the western part of the country, and they toured all the way across the prairies towards Red Deer and Alberta and back through North Saskatchewan area and through Saskatoon, and he toured the land, and this was this fellow named Atticushish. I mean, so we think of, Anthony Henday, what a great explorer, and you go on Wikipedia and there's a map saying, here's where Anthony Henday went, what a great explorer.
Right.
And for Anthony Henday, what was a great exploration of all these different lands, and for Atticushish was just his regular business circuit. And so, because these people didn't keep a lot of business records, or they weren't a written literature society, a lot of the names of them and what actually happened is not very well known. But this trade networks were controlled by these large trading captains like Atticushish, and that's just to me that's a very fascinating thing. All these thousands of people were not all traveling all the way to Hudson's Bay. It could take months to get to Hudson's Bay, going through the territories of different people, and no, it was managed by certain business operatives like this fellow named Atticushish and others, but there's only a few names that emerge from the literature, because they didn't write their own journals. But there you have it. A sort of a very little appreciated dimension to the fur trade is that large parts of it were, not even controlled by direct employees of the Hudson's Bay Company. So, interesting. And then, of course, the relationship between the people. Like I said, it was more or less harmonious. I mean, trade, by its very definition, is mutually beneficial to the people involved. So, the company had to lower its prices, had to change its trade goods to accommodate what people wanted and what they demanded. It had to, when it started going inland, it had to put its forts where people wanted the forts to be, or the factories, or whatever you want to call them, not in a bad location where no one wanted to go, and not in an area where people said, no, you can't go there. So the relationship between the company and its customers and its officers, I mean, the lines blur between all of that. You know what I mean? Because they all had their own families and their own extended families were living through there. And that, of course, that took a change in the 19th century. And a fellow named George Simpson, everyone heard of George Simpson. I mean,
yep. Apparently he wasn't a very good guy.
Yeah. George Simpson, he was, I don't know. It's a word that we can't say on the radio. He comes across, and I'm not the only person that said, I can't invent this about George Simpson. He was basically a major blank. He was abusive towards everyone. He was abusive towards women. He was absolutely, boasted and was proud of his racism towards Indigenous people. He had multiple children with various Indigenous mistresses that he claimed and tossed off without taking responsibility for any of it. He was foul towards any of his own employees, sort of twisting their arm and negotiating bad contracts with them or firing them if he felt like it. I mean, he was universally hated by, let's just say, 95% of people. But he was a logistical genius, though, and he made a lot of money. It's just that he ruined a lot of people's lives. And he introduced into the company corporate culture this idea that you were not going to get promoted if you continued to have Indigenous wives. Oh. And he was the one in the 1830s who had this idea that, no, you have to go and start importing women from Great Britain over, and he wasn't going to allow he told them to cast off their wives and get rid of their children.
Oh boy. And
yeah, I mean, he was just real peace. I mean, so he was in there for 37 years though, in charge of the company, and he was able to manage it. He was a bit of a psychopath, and he controlled all the information coming out of what he called his domain over to Great Britain. And because he was making a lot of money, the directors over there just kind of ignored him, like just pretended they didn't see what was going on. But he was a very abusive character. And he actually completely shifted 150 years of pre-existing corporate culture and changed the company over the decades that he was in charge of it into being a completely different entity to what it had been previously. So a lot of and then of course, the company, it was operating like this in the later 19th century. And then when, the fur trade was in decline, and then when various land settlers of European descent were coming out, either from Eastern Canada or coming from the United States, where they had been coming, or even some from Great Britain started coming on and settling in, what's now Western Canada. The only non-Indigenous cultural institutions that existed were the forts and factories of the fur trade. And their attitude towards Indigenous people had shifted by this time, and Simpson had managed to sort of squeeze out a lot of the Indigenous workers and push out the management of these people. A lot of them ended up going down towards Red River. It's a complicated history, but a lot of it all comes down to George Simpson and his foul cultural ideas that he had, and managed to stamp it on an institution that previously had not been that way. So,
well, there you go. Yeah, you were talking about Métis, and it's like Saskatchewan is home to lots of proud Métis Nation citizens, and the names, it's either Dumont or McLean, if you know what I'm saying. It's either a Scottish background name or a French background name. So not all, of course, not all, of course, but you can a lot. And it's obviously this came down over the centuries. It didn't just happen overnight. Yeah, it came down over the centuries, and a lot of the mixed heritage children of company officers from throughout the whole region moved towards Red River. And that's why they all seem to congregate in that area, looking for some kind of a cultural affiliation, because they didn't really belong in either world, right? And of course, there's many, many other thousands and thousands of people who aren't specifically known to be Métis or specifically identifying as Indigenous, who have, Indigenous genetic heritage in them. I can't tell you how often it is. You're at a party and you're chatting to some people and you're mentioning that you're working on this book. This happened to me many, many times. And they say, I'm technically, sort of part Métis. My grandfather was so-and-so or something. Yep.
It's not enough for them to be officially part of, but huge numbers of people in Western Canada have some form of Indigenous ancestry.
Oh, yes.
So,
and talking with Stephen Bown about the company, the rise and fall of the Hudson's Bay Empire. But it seems to me, reading the early part of the book, the company didn't make much money for the first, 15 years or so?
Yeah, I mean, it was hard for it to make money with it. The French were always attacking them. So, whenever they built, because they were a commercial entity, they had been granted a trading monopoly from the British government, and everyone makes so much of this. Look, they were granted the lords of all this land, and you say, that little piece of paper sure sounds important, but really what it meant is, you'd be free to operate, free from domestic competitors in Britain. And it was a very small operation, as we know, like 6 weeks across the ocean on a creaking ship, and you built some log cabins, and you start doing some commerce. Whenever there was they were not a government entity. They were always a private commercial operation, entirely free of government. But whenever there was a war between Britain and France, France would say, well, we can really get the British. We'll just march up there or sail some ships up there and attack all those ports of the company. That'll damage their commerce, which of course it did, but they weren't national military targets, but nevertheless, they were frequently assaulted by the French. in any of the conflicts throughout the later part of the 17th century and into the early 18th even. So yeah, it's hard to make any money when you're at war, because none of those people who came over, they didn't have any military training. They didn't really have any military weapons either. I mean, they were carpenters or negotiators or just general laborers, or they knew how to sail ships or whatever it might be. So when faced with a military force, whether land or sea, however it came, they often just gave up, and the French would conquer it and seize all their stuff, and then there'd be some peace negotiations, and they would say, okay, you got to give back all the forts that you took of that commercial entity that's up there, and so it would change hands a bunch of times. Yeah, not a lot of money, and of course it started out small too. I mean, people often think of the company as being this gigantic, tectonic, monolithic monopoly that controlled everything and manipulated everyone's life, all the way from the Pacific Ocean to the Hudson's Bay and down. And that was sort of true in the mid-19th century, but at the very beginning of this, there were seldom more than 500 people directly employed by that company. I mean, when I say 500, I mean 500 European ones that were on the payroll in London that were sent over. Of course, all their wives, if you count wives as being people, they all worked and obviously were part of the company too, and all the, as we were talking about earlier, all the hunters and the guides and the general laborers and all other parts. This was run by Indigenous people. I mean, that doesn't count as on their official employment roles, and yet that was probably more than half the people. So, but yeah, it's hard to make money when you're at war all the time. War's not really good. War's not very good for business.
That's right. Stephen R. Bown is with us. The company, The Rise and Fall of the Hudson's Bay Empire, is the book we're discussing right now. But Stephen, I'm looking at the titles you have. So, Island of the Blue Foxes. What was that? The world's greatest scientific expedition, and I've never heard of it. So,
that was my book previous to this one. That was also an 18th century story. That had to do with we know the thing called the Bering Strait.
Yes.
And there was a mariner named Vitus Bering, who was actually a Danish mariner who worked for Russia. And during the 18th century, Russia was trying to expand its territory from its area around Moscow and St. Petersburg all the way west. And this is why Russia owns all of Northern Asia, is because they started sending out this big expedition. And it took 10 years, this expedition. They sent out with thousands of people from Moscow with all the equipment and all the horses and the trains. They went across this land, which had no roads in all of Siberian had no roads. So they spent years and years and years getting out there. And Vitus Bering was in charge of this massive expedition. So it was to go out there and set up Russian cultural institutions and open up some trade to that area for Russia. And he was also supposed to get to the coast, build a shipyard and some barracks for his men, then build a bunch of ships, then get on those ships, sail across the Pacific Ocean, and claim an area, which he did, called Alaska. Alaska used to be Russian.
Yep.
Until it was sold to the United States in 1867.
Seward's
Canada.
Seward's Folly, they called it.
Yeah, exactly. But on the return voyage from that, he grew very sick. And the ships were caught in massive storms, and scurvy was getting them. So the sailors were just dying, and their teeth were falling out, and their old war wounds were opening up, and they were moaning and dying on these ships, and the storm was smashing and ripping them to pieces as they were battered and spun about the North Pacific Ocean for weeks and weeks, until finally the giant waves threw them onto an abandoned island with no people on it, and crashed their ship. And some of them managed to scramble ashore onto the beach, and they had to survive there for a year. And the main inhabitants of this island were feral blue foxes, a subspecies of the Arctic red fox. Yeah, and there were thousands of them, and they were attacking them. So there was a big, giant, year-long battle with all these foxes to try and see who was going to survive on the island. And it's absolutely incredible story. I mean, lots of them died, but a small number of them did manage to survive. And they did manage in the summer to go out and salvage some of the ship's timbers and built a smaller boat and sailed back to, what's now called Russia on that. Yeah, weird. They somehow survived. Survived the whole year on that Arctic island.
Stephen R. Bown, and we're talking about the company, The Rise and Fall of the Hudson's Bay Empire, but there's way more than that. Scurvy, quickly, to spoil the thunder here, that's how come English people are called limeys, right?
Yeah, they are. Because the main solution to scurvy was lemon or lime juice. They didn't know that at the time, of course. They thought they were giving sailors all kinds of calories, but they just didn't understand vitamins and dietary deficiency. And how do you get fresh food when you're on a ship, right?
Right.
I mean, think of it. You're stuck on this wooden thing, and those ships used to spend months at sea sometimes getting anywhere. So, and they would often, the voyages from England would often leave in the spring after a winter. People weren't eating fresh food in the winter either back then, because it's only through burning fossil fuels to create electricity and refrigeration that we have, and giant trucks coming up from California, that we have access to all this food now. People used to have dried and salted, and of course, you don't have anything fresh, you eventually get scurvy, which is a horrible, horrible thing. No one really should have to suffer from that, and no one really does these days. I mean, a lot of indigenous peoples had various remedies for it throughout, the North America anyway, that I know of. But on the ships, it was really hard for them to get, to survive. And more sailors died from scurvy than they did from any other cause: shipwrecks, storms, battles. I mean, they would load a ship up with let's say a ship with 800 people crammed on this little wooden ship. Several months into the voyage, it would already be down to 400. So they almost they packed them with extra people, knowing that they were going to die. Oh. But the irony is that it was the overcrowding and the poor food that created the death in the first place. So,
well,
yeah.
Who was the first person to bite into a lime and say, "Oh, this is really good. Let's eat these and we'll save ourselves"? How did they? How did they discover?
I mean, there's stories of these sailors when they got like some oranges or something. Like they're on death's door, and someone they put in an island somewhere, they managed to get some lemons or limes or something like that, and they would be biting into them, and their bodies would apparently start shaking and convulsing, and within a couple of days of eating that, they'd be up and walking around again, even though people thought they were just basically dead. Like, this person's dead. You're going to be dead in a couple of days. And a couple of days of eating some fresh food, especially oranges and lemons, and their bodies would be shaking and convulsing, and they would get better. Yeah, but of course, where did lemons grow? Lemons were from the Mediterranean back then, and who was England at war with? Well, usually France and Spain.
Right.
And who controls the western access to the Mediterranean? France and Spain.
France and Spain.
So they couldn't get to the lemons, which were all growing there, and so they started growing limes in the West Indies. And that's why they wanted to own some islands there in the first place.
Oh,
so they could have lime plantations. Now, limes aren't as good as lemons or oranges, but they started to have huge British lime plantations on like Jamaica, and they were giving them all to the Royal Navy. So that's where the limeys comes from. Yeah.
Okay.
But
Stephen R. Bown is with us, the company. Sorry, Stephen, I'm going to have to kind of wrap things up here today. However, what is your next project before we leave you?
Well, I have started working on it. I mean, I ended the company pretty quick. I tied up some loose ends, and I really wanted to end it. I ended it when its monopoly officially ended in 1870, but my main part of the story ended a bit before that, and so I wanted to explore that time period a bit more, and so I wanted to talk about the first railway coming through, which was late just decades after the company ceased to exist, and how that further impacted and changed the lands, and it's a much darker period of time in history, I think, with disease and American whiskey traders,
mm-hmm.
and land, the treaties being negotiated, and blended into that is some adventure about the construction, the survey for the railway all the way out to BC, and it's inextricably linked to the political dynamic and how Canada actually came to exist as a country. As I call it an empire. Canada was conceived as an empire from the east, with Western Canada being the appendages to the empire, sort of like a captive market for them to sell manufactured goods to.
Right.
Sort of not someone has changed over time.
Yeah, it's not much different than today.
No, I mean, perhaps that's just my Western Canadianness coming through.
Yeah,
but,
me too.
So, yeah.
How do we, you have a website, of course, and it's a very extensive one.
Yeah, it's...
Tell us about it.
It's StephenRBown.net, Stephen with a PH. I'm sure if you just typed in Stephen Bown and the company, my website would come up anyway. It just lists all the different projects all the different books that I've written, and almost all of them are still in print now. They're all on topics having to do with adventure and travel and travelers and explorers and the company that really wanted to explore the lives of interesting people and the explorers in the fur trade. And that's a theme in all my writing. I like to sort of bring alive what the world was like for different people at different time periods and how that contrasts to today. That's something I've always been interested in.
And there we have it. The Company, The Rise and Fall of the Hudson's Bay Empire by Stephen R. Bown, but lots of other books out there as well. Stephen, thank you very much for your time and good luck in the future.
Thank you. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you for visiting with us today. This is Talking Books and Stuff with Dennis Rimmer. Contact him at dennis@talkingbooks.tk. Thank you, and may all the good news be yours. Oh, and don't forget to check out his book, The Great Canadian Notebook, available across Canada and at amazon.ca.